Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Hey there, ready to dive into some serious history?
Let's go.
Today we're exploring Martin Luther King Jr.'s final campaign
Okay.
in Memphis back in 1968.
All right.
We're going to uncover why he went there,
Yeah.
what unfolded, and how those events ultimately reshaped his legacy.
Wow.
You sent in a really insightful podcast episode as our main source. So let's unpack this together. This one hits hard.
Yeah, it really does. What's particularly striking about this period in King's life is how his vision had broadened.
Okay.
By 1968, he wasn't just focused on dismantling segregation in the South anymore.
You're right. It was a much bigger picture than that.
Yeah.
He was tackling economic justice on a national scale.
Exactly. He launched the Poor People's Campaign,
Wow.
a movement aimed at systemic change to combat poverty and inequality across the U.S.
Right.
You were interested in King's evolution as a leader, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Well, this shift to economic justice is crucial because it demonstrates how his understanding of equality was deepening.
Okay.
He realized that legal rights were just one part of the equation.
Yeah.
True freedom meant addressing the economic realities that kept people trapped in poverty.
And this focus on economic justice is precisely what led him to Memphis, wasn't it?
Yes.
The sanitation workers' strike was a flashpoint.
Precisely in February of 1968,
Okay.
Black sanitation workers in Memphis went on strike,
Right.
protesting deplorable working conditions and blatant discrimination.
Wow.
Think about it. Have you ever felt like your voice wasn't being heard?
Oh, yeah.
That's what these workers were experiencing.
Yeah.
And their struggle resonated with King's evolving vision.
Absolutely. And then there's the human element of this story.
Yes.
The tragic deaths of two workers,
Right.
Echol and Robert Walker. The podcast mentioned how they were crushed by a malfunctioning garbage truck.
It's
hard to imagine a more potent symbol of the dangers and injustices these workers face daily.
Their deaths certainly brought national attention to the strike.
Yeah.
And for King, this wasn't just a distant news story.
Right.
He saw this strike as the embodiment of the very economic injustice he was committed to fighting.
Okay.
It was a call to action he couldn't ignore.
So he heads to Memphis, right into the heart of this struggle.
Yep.
Now, I have to admit, when I was listening to the podcast,
Okay.
the part about the four historical perspectives on King's Memphis campaign got a little jargony
Oh, yeah.
with all the historiography terms.
Right.
Could you break down what those different perspectives actually offer in a way that, well, anyone can understand?
Absolutely. It's not just academic jargon.
Okay.
These different lenses help us see the same events in new ways.
Gotcha.
First, you've got the classic civil rights lens.
Right.
This one views the Memphis campaign as a natural progression of King's lifelong fight for equality, moving beyond just legal rights
Okay.
to address the underlying economic systems that perpetuate inequality.
Okay, I'm following so far. What about the other perspectives?
Well, then there's the labor history perspective.
Okay.
This one highlights King's solidarity with working people, showing how intertwined labor rights and racial justice truly are.
Yeah.
It reminds us that economic justice wasn't just an abstract concept for King. He saw it playing out in the lives of everyday workers.
Right, so it wasn't just about theoretical ideas, but about real people's lives.
Exactly. Then things get even more interesting with the new left perspective.
Ooh, okay.
This lens takes a more radical view,
Okay.
interpreting King's actions in Memphis as a direct challenge to capitalism itself.
Wow.
They see him critiquing the very economic structures that create and maintain inequality.
Interesting.
It's a bold interpretation,
Yeah.
but it helps us understand the growing frustration with systemic issues during this era.
And finally, there's the social movement lens.
Right.
This one seemed to focus on the complexities and divisions within the civil rights movement at the time.
Right. This lens is all about context.
Okay.
It highlights King's struggle to hold together a movement
Okay.
that was becoming increasingly diverse and facing internal tensions. Remember, this was a period of immense social and political change.
Yeah.
The rise of Black power ideologies, which often advocated for more militant approaches to achieving racial justice, presented a challenge to King's commitment to nonviolence.
It was a real turning point, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And then you have the events of the march and King openly questioning the effectiveness of nonviolence.
Right.
When I heard that part of the podcast, it really stopped me in my tracks.
It's a powerful moment, no doubt.
Yeah.
On March 28th, King leads a march in Memphis.
Okay.
And it erupts into violence.
Oh, wow.
This deeply troubles him, shaking his core beliefs to the core.
Mm-hmm.
In a moment of raw honesty, he even says,
Oh, wow.
maybe we just have to admit that the day of violence is here, and maybe we have to just give up and let violence take its course.
Wow.
Can you imagine? King, the very symbol of nonviolent resistance,
Right.
expressing such deep doubt in his life's work.
It's a gut punch, for sure.
Ah.
So what happens next? Does King succumb to this despair?
Wow.
We know he didn't abandon nonviolence altogether,
The
but
boy doesn't give up.
okay.
In fact, just a few days later,
Mhm.
he returns to Memphis and delivers what would become one of his most iconic speeches.
Oh, wow.
I've been to the Mountaintop.
Right.
This was April 3rd,
Okay.
the day before his assassination.
When I heard the podcast play a clip of that speech, I got goosebumps.
Oh, yeah.
King, knowing he might not live to see his dream realized,
Right.
yet still urging others forward. It's incredibly powerful.
It really is.
He connects the sanitation worker struggle to the broader fight for justice, calling for unity and economic action.
Mm-hmm.
And then his closing words, almost prophetic. I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but we as a people will get to the promised land.
Those words delivered with such conviction.
Yeah.
Knowing what was to come, it speaks volumes about his unwavering belief in the cause,
Wow.
even in the face of incredible adversity.
And then tragedy.
Yeah.
The very next day, King is assassinated.
Yeah.
Riots erupt across the U.S. It's this outpouring of anger and frustration, a reflection of the deep wounds of a nation still grappling with racial and economic injustice.
It was a devastating blow to the civil rights movement,
Yeah.
a movement that was already facing internal divisions.
Right.
King's death left a void, raising the question,
Yeah.
where does the movement go from here?
Right.
How do they carry on his legacy in a world that feels even more fractured?
We've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
King's evolution as a leader, the context of the Memphis sanitation workers' strike, and the various ways historians interpret his final campaign.
Mm-hmm.
But for our listener, what would you say is the most important takeaway from all this?
I think the key takeaway is understanding the complexity of King's legacy.
Yep.
He wasn't just a symbol of nonviolent resistance.
Right. Oh.
He was a complex figure who evolved over time, grappling with difficult questions and pushing for increasingly radical change.
Yeah.
It's easy to put historical figures on a pedestal and forget they were real people, too.
He wasn't a static figure frozen in time.
You know?
He was a living, breathing human being who adapted to the changing circumstances around him.
Exactly. And in Memphis, we see him at a pivotal moment,
Okay.
confronting new challenges and pushing the boundaries of his own philosophy. It's almost as if he was laying the groundwork for a new phase of the fight for justice, one that went beyond legal equality and tackled the systemic roots of economic inequality.
That message feels incredibly relevant today, wouldn't you say? The fight for social and economic justice is far from over.
Absolutely. Think about the movements we're seeing today.
Yeah.
Around economic inequality, racial justice, and labor rights. They all echo King's message from Memphis.
Right.
It's a marathon, not a sprint. And we can all learn from King's example. He showed us that everyone has a role to play in the fight for justice.
Okay.
It wasn't just about grand gestures or iconic speeches.
Okay.
It was about the daily actions we take, the choices we make, and how we treat each other.
He demonstrated that beautifully in Memphis by standing in solidarity with the sanitation workers.
Yeah, he saw their struggle as a microcosm of a larger battle for economic justice.
Right.
And he wasn't afraid to put himself on the line to support them. It's a powerful reminder that seemingly small actions can contribute to a much bigger picture.
Yeah.
Think about it. What connections do you see between issues in your own community and the fight for broader societal change?
That's such an important question for our listener to consider.
It is.
What issues in their own communities resonate with King's message?
Right.
How can they get involved and make a difference? There's so much we could learn from the past.
We discussed 4 different historical perspectives on King's campaign in Memphis. But ultimately, it's up to each of us to interpret his legacy and apply those lessons to our own lives.
Yeah.
History isn't just about memorizing dates and facts.
Right.
It's about understanding the past to inform our present and shape our future.
King's story, especially his time in Memphis, offers so much to reflect on and learn from.
It does.
One of the most striking things is the contrast between the darkness of his assassination
Yeah.
and the enduring hope of his message.
It's certainly a bittersweet legacy, the tragedy of his untimely death, but also the inspiration of his words and actions.
And that inspiration continues to fuel movements for justice all over the world. Even in the face of setbacks and challenges, King's vision reminds us to keep pushing forward,
Yeah.
to keep striving for a more just and equitable society. His words from the Mountaintop speech come to mind. "I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but we as a people will get to the promised land."
And those words weren't just about reaching a specific destination, they were about the journey itself, the ongoing struggle for justice that continues to this day. It's a journey that requires all of us to participate, to engage, and to contribute in whatever way we can.
Wow.
It's fascinating to think about how much the world has changed since 1968.
Yeah.
Yet so many of the issues King fought for are still relevant today.
It speaks to how deeply rooted these problems are,
Yeah.
but also to the enduring power of his message.
His voice continues to resonate across generations, reminding us that the fight for justice is never truly over. It requires courage, compassion, and the refusal to give up hope.
Powerful words to live by King's legacy reminds us that we can all make a difference,
Right.
even when faced with seemingly insurmountable challenges.
It's about recognizing the interconnectedness of our struggles,
Yeah.
standing in solidarity with those who are marginalized, and working together to create a more just and equitable world.
This has been a powerful conversation. I think we've given our listener a lot to think about.
I hope so. King's story is one that deserves to be studied, discussed, and debated for generations to come. It's a story that challenges us to be better, to do better, and to never stop striving for a more perfect union.
Before we wrap up this deep dive into King's final campaign, I want to leave our listener with a final thought. We've talked a lot about King's legacy, the impact of his work, and the ongoing struggle for justice. But it's important to remember that King wasn't just an icon or a historical figure. He was a real person with flaws, doubts, and fears, just like the rest of us.
That's a crucial point. Sometimes with historical figures of King's stature, it's easy to forget their humanity.
Exactly. And in Memphis, we see King at his most vulnerable, questioning his methods, wrestling with the complexities of a changing world, and ultimately facing his own mortality.
It's a powerful reminder that even the greatest leaders are human.
Right.
And that their struggles and triumphs are ultimately our own.
So here's the thought I want to leave our listener with. What would it mean to embrace both King's iconic legacy and his human complexity?
It certainly suggests that we shouldn't shy away from those messy parts of history, the contradictions and the ambiguities.
It's about recognizing that progress isn't a straight line. There are setbacks, and even the most inspiring figures have moments of doubt and uncertainty.
For sure.
To really learn from King's story, we need to acknowledge both his strengths and his weaknesses.
It's a more nuanced and realistic way to engage with history, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We can see King not just as a symbol, but as someone on the same long road to justice as all of us.
Yeah.
Someone who stumbled, questioned, and ultimately persevered despite huge challenges.
It's inspiring.
His story is a reminder that we all have the capacity to grow and change, even when things get difficult.
And that's a message that speaks to us even today.
As we conclude this deep dive into King's final campaign, I want to encourage you to think about the connections we've made between the past and the present. How can you carry King's legacy forward in your own life?
Remember, the fight for justice is an ongoing process. We all have a part to play in it. Yeah.
Never give up hope.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into Martin Luther King Jr.'s final campaign. We hope you found it informative, thought-provoking, and ultimately inspiring.
It really is.
So much to think about. You know, we often talk about, you know, these historical figures, almost as though they're, you know, superhuman.
Right.
But, you know, this really brings home that, you know, even someone as revered as Dr. King faced these very human struggles and doubts and...
Absolutely. And it makes his accomplishments all the more remarkable, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think so, because, you know, he persevered.
He did.
In the face of all that, you know, and continued to fight for what he believed in.
And that's a really powerful message for all of us, I think.
It is. And I think, you know, as we wrap up this deep dive into King's final campaign, you know, we've talked about a lot of, you know, really kind of heavy stuff.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to remember that, you know, there's still hope.
There is.
You know, his legacy continues to inspire people
all over the world to fight for justice and equality.
And that's something worth celebrating.
It is. And you know, I think it's up to each of us to, kind of take that inspiration and figure out how we can make a difference in our own lives.
Absolutely. We can all be part of that change.
We can. And on that note, I think it's a good place to end our conversation.
Yeah, I think so.
So thank you for joining us for this deep dive into Martin Luther King Jr.'s final campaign.
It's my pleasure.
And as always, we hope you found it informative, thought-provoking, and ultimately inspiring.
Thanks for having me.
We'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.